looking across the treatment works as we stand on a huge stockpile of uranium ore. And from now on, the Northern Territory will play an important part in our lives and also in yours, as Australia becomes one of the largest uranium-producing countries in the world.
At 60 years old, the waste and contamination is still causing havoc at this site.
A day after an inquiry into the disaster blamed the Territory government's tick and flick approach to regulation, the Minister was again...
Time and time again we've been burnt by mining companies coming up with these ideas, and the government seems to roll out the red carpet and allow these projects to get up and fall over, get up and fall over.
We have by and large clean river systems, clean underground water systems, pristine savanna country. A lot of our places haven't been touched by industrialisation.
And certainly the Territory as a whole needs more industry, whether it's gas or something else.
Of course, the sooner you get going, the sooner those benefits, those jobs, that industry can start.
There are real jobs right now in tourism, cattle, fishing and farming, and as Chief Minister, I will make a decision that puts Territorians first.
The gas industry's push to resume fracking in the Northern Territory has been stymied by a legacy of resources industry and regulatory failures. The 2010 Montara inquiry found the Territory's minimalist regulation and a far too comfortable relationship with the operator contributed to Australia's worst offshore oil and gas disaster. The company PTTEP was fined just $500,000.
The understanding at the time, now in hindsight, was not up to speed, and that's what we need to focus on.
In 2013, the Territory government didn't prosecute Energy Resources of Australia after it spilled 1 million litres of uranium from an ageing processing tank at its Ranger mine. The same year, the Territory gave major project status to 2 iron ore mines near the Roper River, which quickly collapsed without rehabilitating. In 2014, Glencore's MacArthur River mine waste rock dump started spontaneously combusting because the Territory government disregarded warnings about the amount of toxic rock on the site. Glencore was fined $700 for smoke pollution. The incidents have compounded a legacy of toxic, leaking uranium, copper and gold mines, including Mount Todd near Katherine.
AFAN blew the whistle on Mount Todd. No one was actually maintaining the tailings dams, and those tailings dams were filling up and overflowing uncontrollably into the Edith River, and that's when we started to see fish kills.
That's exactly how it should work. If a member of the public sees something go wrong, please report it, because it would be disingenuous for a government to claim they can monitor everything all the time.
Now the Chief Executive of the Resources Department, Alistair Trier, refused an interview on the government's regulation record. Scott Perkins was the department's boss for 2 years under the country Liberals.
Oh, look, humans learn from mistakes, and we've seen a very, very rapid learning curve. The balance between economic benefit and environmental amenity is always a tricky one to get to.
By 2016, the country Liberals had opened 85% of the Territory up to gas exploration applications. A handful of wells were drilled and fracked.
Everybody was learning at the time, but for the very limited activity that we had going on in the Northern Territory at the time, we were able to keep on top of it. Had that activity expanded rapidly, we may have had difficulty.
The hydraulic fracturing process now begins.
Unlike Queensland's shallower coal seam gas, the territory's methane reserves are trapped deep underground. Companies need to break up the shale rocks to force it out. In the horizontal section of wells, they use explosive charges and then pump down millions of litres of water at high pressure, along with chemicals and sand, to extract the gas from the resulting fractures. The industry zeroed in on the Beetaloo Basin between the Stuart Highway towns of Mataranka and Elliot and identified what it believes is enough gas to power Australia for 200 years.
We're talking about some of the most significant resources of natural gas in Australia underlying the Northern Territory. The development of those resources will mean there is ample gas to service both the Northern Territory market itself, the Eastern Australian market, and potentially increase the already significant exports of natural gas from the Northern Territory.
But community concerns stopped the gas industry in its tracks. The Gunner government won the 2016 election, promising a fracking moratorium and inquiry.
The government will, as of today, implement its election commitment to introduce a moratorium on hydraulic fracturing.
Hey boss, how are you, mate? Good to see you.
They've bought Michael Gunner a breathing space. Now Canberra is turning up the heat.
There's a lot of gas in the north, Michael. Pull the trigger, Gunner. Pull the trigger.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming along to this community consultation of the scientific inquiry into hydraulic fracturing in the Northern Territory.
The fracking inquiry, led by a former New South Wales Land Court judge, will deliver its final report in March. Its draft report has concluded the risks of fracking are mostly low.
If the recommendations made in this draft report are adopted and implemented in full, those risks may be mitigated or reduced, and in some cases eliminated altogether, to acceptable levels of having regard.
That sits uncomfortably alongside its finding that overwhelmingly people told it fracking is not safe, not trusted and not wanted.
We heard from the community time and time again that they didn't have any faith in government and in the regulator.
I guess it's really up to the community to... In the heart of the Beetaloo Basin, many pastoralists have major concerns. Gina Reinhardt owns the gas exploration rights on Colin Ross's $200 million operation. Other companies have approvals on neighbouring stations.
The whole industry's got a terrible track record, and they're saying is that there's minimal risk. Well, I think that when they say there's minimal risk, that means there is risk, and if there's risk, I don't believe that we should be even thinking about it.
In the wet season it's lush, but in the dry, like most people here, he's dependent on the interlinked network of freshwater aquifers the gas company would drill through.
The majority of the water we use is bore water. We pump to the surface, and obviously we're extremely worried about contamination, and we're worried about the depletion of the aquifer.
His neighbour Rod Dunbar's property was approved for fracking by Origin Energy. The company's own impact assessment rated the risk of its drilling causing aquifers to leak into each other as high, likely and serious.
If another aquifer's got a high salt content or some other content in it, it could damage the aquifer that we're using to water the cattle.
So what Origin did was engineer it and design our surface casing such that there was no possibility for cross flow between those two aquifers. So it was identified through a thorough, rigorous risk assessment, and then that risk was eliminated through engineering.
Some cattlemen here didn't oppose exploration fracking on their properties.
So this is it, this is all that's left. Basically there's at least 4 layers of steel casing plus concrete between the where the whole, the well itself and the surrounding country and the aquifer. And then I guess the other thing is that they're going so deep that they're not going to impact that particular aquifer where we get our cattle water from.
Rowan Sullivan also did work clearing tracks for the gas industry.
I think that the state of the territory economy is such that I don't think we can afford to be saying we're just not going to do anything. We're not going to look at this resource.
The inquiry's recommended pastoralists should have no right of veto to stop the gas industry coming onto their properties.
They could find gas at my neighbour's place, and obviously them drilling there could affect this place. Certainly all this water here finishes up at Mataranka into the hot springs, so you'll have a really bad effect on tourism.
Tourism businesses are also dependent on the aquifer-fed springs and Roper River.
I think people hear rumours that the springs or whatever is going to be damaged, so they just stay away. This is the river camping area, which is very...
Glenys Summers has spent 7 years developing her business.
And if they muck up our water table, drop it by even, 2 or 3 metres, we're all in trouble.
To the area's Manggarai Indigenous people, the springs and rivers are sacred.
We don't want fracking because seeing all the things it does, we heard stories about America, what they done there. So we don't want to suffer around here.
The fire was so intense, first responders could feel the heat a half a mile away.
The inquiry found in the United States bad regulatory governance of the shale gas revolution has resulted in worse environmental outcomes. Quoting the CSIRO, it reported about 1 in 1,000 US production wells have leaked, but there isn't enough information to determine how many abandoned shale wells have failed.
Just like that.
In the United States, there is, of course, the legacy problem of wells that were drilled 30, 40, 50, and in some cases 80 and 100 years ago, under conditions that were not as stringent as those that we have today.
And so what we're seeing and what the research is showing, and especially the research coming out of Duke University, is that methane is escaping up some of these wells, and the wells are the pathway for methane to get into shallow groundwater.
Let me get the other one.
The inquiry found in Queensland the rate of coal seam gas well failure has been low to almost zero. However, the industry isn't denying any problems. Origin Energy is drilling vent wells near the Condamine River to let excess gas escape. The industry prefers to point to South Australia as proof of a good track record.
And you can look at places like the Cooper Basin, where we have the coexistence of organic farming at surface with Australia's most similar type project to the Beetaloo, so a relatively intensive development. So I think the record of the industry is very strong.
In the Cooper Basin in South Australia, the first shale well was fracked in 2011, yet the company claims they've had a long and successful history with this. Ultimately, they're just experimenting at the moment.
By and large, we've got inquiries like the ones that we've seen in the Northern Territory because of the fact that a communication battle has been lost by the production industry.
But in the Beetaloo Basin Service Centre, Katherine, businesses which were getting gas industry work were hit hard by the moratorium.
We had quite a lot more staff, up to about the 40 mark, and now at the moment we're down to 10, 12 people.
Her fracking questions have been answered.
Listening to the Department of Mines and Energy, again, I can't say I feel quite comfortable. Apparently our regulations in the Northern Territory are one of the highest there are.
Yeah, she's lovely. She's lovely.
Other local businesses are looking for new breaks.
I'd just like to see new industries in place for my grandchildren, and that they can stay here and they can grow with the town. At the moment, we're not growing.
The gas industry's annual conference in the processing hub of Darwin has been its forum for pushing the Beetaloo development case.
If it is commercial, we will see real, genuine economic benefits. For a success case, there are substantial employment benefits, substantial revenues to the Northern Territory government.
The inquiry has found if the industry's planned 1,000 Beetaloo wells go ahead, over 25 years, economic benefits could include up to 13,000 jobs, 16 billion more spent on goods and services, and an annual territory government budget boost of 1 to 2%. Some analysts are questioning those estimates as too optimistic.
Their own commissioned advice is quite clear that the best case scenario would see an extra 500 jobs created in the territory over the next 25 years. The 13,000 figure is a complete misinterpretation.
We believe, whether we're talking here about hundreds of jobs or thousands of jobs, the economic benefits are very substantial.
The inquiry hasn't modelled the question it's raised of whether fracking risks adverse economic impacts to other industries, which may outweigh economic benefits.
These jobs are a short-term thing. Territorians are here forever, and we need to make sure that we've got jobs and we've got security and we've got a livelihood to pass on to our kids into the future.
Any prospect of negative impacts on other industries is very small indeed. We will plan our activities very carefully to work with other industries, to collaborate with them and ensure there are no negative impacts from our activity and that the community that hosts that activity will benefit from it.
In the inquiry, the gas industries won the scientific argument on the risks of fracking.
What this report does is provide recommendations to mitigate to acceptable levels the identified risks associated with any onshore shale gas development in the Northern Territory if the moratorium is lifted.
But key questions remain.
It's hard to understand what an acceptable risk is, and certainly we would be pushing, and we are pushing the government as hard as we possibly can to make sure that they eliminate any possibility of contamination or problems going into our aquifers.
The inquiry has concluded most risks to water are low, and the prospect of wells leaking chemicals into aquifers is unlikely.
With modern methodologies, with high standards of engineering, and particularly with very strong environmental oversight, the risks associated with wells leaking is extremely low.
The inquiry determined the risk of wells leaking gas into aquifers is low to medium, but that methane is non-toxic in groundwater.
If we start to introduce a sufficient amount of methane into billabongs and wetlands and so on, then we are at risk of changing some aerobic wetlands into potentially anaerobic, and that's a very serious issue.
Surface spills of chemicals were judged likely, but a low risk of travelling through to the aquifer. This has not been Catherine's experience, where PFAS firefighting foam sprayed on its defence base in the mid-2000s has contaminated water bores and fish 200 kilometres away in the Daly River.
Well, there's a couple of big lessons to be learnt from what's happened with the PFAS and how easy contaminants can get into our groundwater, and that needs to be addressed, and the governments, both federal government and territory government, need to be very conscious of the fact that whilst all the best practices are being put in place, simple little things can go wrong that can have catastrophic problems into the future.
The inquiry found the risk of abandoned wells leaking water or gases low, with world-leading practice decommissioning.
We can't be too overconfident that once we just put cement down the hole and walk away, it's as simple as that. I think you've got sometimes very corrosive chemistry, you've got all sorts of factors that can act over the long term to impact on the integrity of that seal that was put down on that well.
There's no reason for them to degrade over time, and by the time our operations have been completed, there's nothing in the well that is going to cause any environmental impact anyway.
It found even if abandoned wells do degrade, they're unlikely to leak.
There's simply not the pressure conditions to force that material, those hydrocarbons to the surface, and the long pathways make it extremely unlikely.
The inquiry found there is a low risk of excessive water use, lowering local groundwater, as long as no gas wells are built within 1 kilometre of bores. But it couldn't determine the risk of lowering regional groundwater. In an apparent contradiction to its headline conclusion, it said, the panel has not been able to make a definitive assessment of the risk of unsustainable groundwater use, unacceptable contamination of groundwaters, or unacceptable impacts on aquatic ecosystems.
The constant emphasis on risks being low and manageable, I think, is something that is just shows too much confidence. That we need to be much more realistic and mindful of examples like PFAS, like MacArthur River, like Rum Jungle and Red Bank and so on.
The inquiry panel has rejected the suggestion its findings are contradictory, and it's confident that regional scientific studies it has recommended before any gas production starts will confirm fracking risks can be mitigated. Justice Pepper initially agreed to be interviewed about the inquiry's conclusions so far, but then declined.
With very high quality regulatory environment, it is possible to reduce the risks associated with shale gas development to levels that are acceptable for most people in the community.
The inquiry was scathing of the Territory's regulatory regime and has recommended a complete overhaul.
Our very strong view is that the regulator at the moment is the entity that's responsible both for the promotion of the industry, the promotion of the resource, and its regulation.
A lot was made of a lack of independence that was made, a lot of mischievous information went out about that. The fact is the department was and still is promoting or making public the geological possibilities of a varying range of activities within the Northern Territory. It's not actually going out and promoting that people should come here. Companies make that decision by themselves.
The panel has recommended a more independent regulator with sharper teeth, paid for by the industry.
One of the really important things, I think, is that the costs are not so high that they prevent the activity from taking place.
The inquiry has also recommended making more areas, including national parks, fracking no-go zones.
It will still affect us regardless, because our land connects with all other tribal groups' country with the songline, our ceremony. It all connects.
Jawoyn leaders own and manage the premier Nipmuc Gorge tourist attraction near Katherine.
Anyone these days can come and say, look, I've got $1 million and I want to do something on your country. By all means, those people can just say yes. All they see is that dollar sign. But, as the old saying, money is the root of all evil. And we just got to be very, very careful.
In the Beetaloo Basin, communities are stepping up protest action, particularly as it's become clear the gas industry would settle for fracking here first as a test case.
Most Territorians looking at this inquiry are saying there is no sacrifice zone in this. We will stand up for any part of the Territory that is at risk.
But Canberra is also increasing pressure on the Territory to develop its gas.
There are about 60,000 jobs in manufacturing industries that rely on gas for more than 10% of their input costs, and those jobs will be put at risk if we can't get enough gas.
The The inquiry notes public anxiety has halted fracking in 5 Australian states, France, Germany and several US states. But with the territory budget deeply dependent on Canberra, the Commonwealth's pulling every lever, including threatening to cut GST and grants.
The way we reallocate funding across our nation does try to reflect the natural resources that individual states and territories have.
There's intense pressure on the Gunner government to kickstart a flagging economy. With a large parliamentary majority, there's little chance of Labour losing office by saying yes.
So I want you government people to listen to me. I'm talking for all my people. We speak different languages, but the land is for all people. We own the land, we own the water.
But the territory's recent political history is one of unpopular decisions toppling chief ministers from within. The only political imperatives that could block a pro-fracking decision are threats to Michael Gunner's leadership from left faction MPs or the party rank and file.
So we made a very clear promise at the last election as a Labor Party, and I'm the leader of that we would make a decision based off that final report. And I've got to say, everyone I've talked to in the Labor movement's been very positive about the process so far, about the report being handed down and a decision being made at the end of it.
The inquiry's draft findings are open to challenge until March.
Once the moratorium's lifted under legislation, the current legislation, they can force their way in here and we won't be able to stop them. So I think they'll come and I think they'll destroy this country.
There's now a last opportunity to lobby government.
We'd really like government to listen to the science and take that on board rather than make an emotional decision on whether this industry should come back.
And win hearts and minds before this crucial decision.
What we're playing with here is everybody's future and the environment. And if you get it wrong, how are we going to rectify that problem? Because at the end of the day, when those mines close and go, we are the people left here. We're left here looking after the legacy mines. We're left here managing the problems that we've got.
To boost economic growth. Live performance.
Women have been great role models.